In the heart of a vibrant city where skyscrapers rise majestically and neon lights blink incessantly, lives a boy named Ethan. He is only 11 years old, but his eyes, one a deep blue and the other brown like wet earth, carry the wisdom and sadness of a much longer life. These differently colored eyes are a legacy from his mother, a free-spirited woman who left too soon, leaving Ethan alone to face the world. Ethan roams the busy streets, invisible to the hurried eyes of pedestrians. He hides in the shadows of alleys, finding shelter among cardboard boxes and torn blankets. His nights are long and cold, with the biting wind whispering empty promises of warmth. But it is during these moments of solitude that he remembers the tales his mother used to tell, stories of courage, love, and hope. His stomach growled with hunger as he scavenged through the trash cans of cafes and restaurants. Occasionally, someone would toss a coin or a piece of bread his way, a quick gesture that momentarily relieved his hunger but not his loneliness. School was a distant memory, an institution that seemed to belong to another world, a world where children didn't have to worry about the next meal or the safety of a place to sleep. Despite the hardships, Ethan had a resilient spirit. He befriended other street boys, forming a small dysfunctional family that shared what little they had. Together, they created a support network, protecting each other from the dangers of the streets. But even among friends, Ethan felt a deep void, a hole left by his mother's absence. Each day was a battle, each night a victory just by surviving. The past was a heavy burden, but the future was a blank page waiting to be written. Ethan didn't know what destiny held for him, but he was determined to keep going, one step at a time, with eyes wide open, one blue, the other brown, facing the world with the courage his mother had taught him. Ethan was a rare and unforgettable sight. His differently colored eyes, one as deep blue as the ocean and the other earthy brown like the forest, were his trademark. These eyes not only attracted the curiosity of strangers, but also told a story of their own, a story of loss and resilience. As he walked the streets, people couldn't help but notice. Some glances were of pure curiosity, others of surprise, and some even of fear, as if his eyes held secrets they preferred not to know. Ethan, however, was used to it. He had learned to ignore the whispers and furtive glances, treating the comments as part of his daily life. But there was something in Ethan's eyes that made people look twice, a depth that seemed to pull them into a world they didn't fully understand. Ethan remembered clearly the day his mother told him about his heterochromia. "You have a gift, my love," she said, her own eyes shining with pride. "Your eyes are like windows to two different souls, and that's what makes you so special." These words became a mantra for Ethan, a constant reminder that despite his situation, he possessed something extraordinary. Sometimes, Ethan wondered if his eyes could be the key to a different future. Maybe someone would see beyond the surface and recognize the value his mother always saw in him. But until then, his eyes were a mixed blessing, a beauty that carried both hope and the weight of his past. Ethan's eyes also had a strange ability to see the world in different ways. Through the blue eye, the world seemed colder, more distant, as if he were looking through a window covered in ice. Through the brown eye, everything seemed warmer and closer, as if he could feel the heat and texture of the things around him. This duality gave Ethan a unique perspective, an ability to see the best and worst in people and situations. It was this ability that helped him survive on the streets. He could see kindness in small actions, a stranger's smile, the coin left discreetly, the piece of bread shared. But he could also see hardness and indifference, the cold looks and cruel comments. Ethan learned to navigate between these extremes, always keeping hope alive, even when the world seemed determined to crush it. Thus, Ethan continued his journey through the city's streets, his different colored eyes shining like beacons in the darkness. And with each step, he carried the memory of his mother and the promise that one day, his special eyes would guide him to a place where he could finally find peace and belonging. The city was a place of contrasts, wealth and poverty coexisting side by side, hope and despair vying for space on the same streets. At the center of this urban stage was Richard Anderson, the charismatic mayor whose popularity was as high as the skyscrapers that lined the horizon. Richard had a magnetic way of speaking, with a voice that could calm an angry crowd or incite a room full of citizens to a standing ovation. He was known for his ability to navigate the turbulent waters of politics with grace and efficiency, balancing conflicting interests with a confident smile and a firm hand. His charisma came not only from his words but also from his actions. He was a man of action, someone who genuinely cared about the people he governed. Born and raised in the city, Richard understood its complexities deeply. He had promised voters that he would improve the lives of the less fortunate, that he would bring opportunities where there was only despair. And in many ways he was fulfilling that promise. Parks were revitalized, schools received more funding, and new aid programs were established for those in need. But behind Richard's impeccable facade were well-guarded secrets. He was a man who understood the value of public image, but who also knew the fragility of truth. There were moments during the long sleepless nights when ghosts from the past came to haunt him, reminding him of mistakes he preferred to forget. It was on one of these sleepless nights that Richard decided to visit one of the city's children's shelters. Without the usual entourage of advisors and photographers, he wanted to see firsthand the impact of the programs he had implemented. He always believed that a leader should be among the people, especially those who needed him most. At the shelter, Richard walked among the children, listening to their stories, seeing their smiles and tears. It was then that his eyes met Ethan's. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Those different colors, that penetrating gaze. Richard felt a wave of familiarity hit him like a punch in the stomach. The boy was sitting alone, half hidden in a shadow, but his eyes shone with an intensity that seemed to illuminate the entire room. Richard felt an immediate connection, an inexplicable tug at his heart. He approached, kneeling to be at Ethan's eye level. "Hi," Richard said, his voice soft and friendly. "What's your name?" "Ethan," the boy replied without looking away. "You have amazing eyes, Ethan," Richard said, a genuine smile forming on his lips. "They are very special." Ethan just shrugged, used to comments about his appearance. But Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something deep and disturbing about that resemblance. The connection he felt was not just curiosity. It was something more primal, something he still couldn't define. As he left the shelter that night, the image of Ethan and his different colored eyes was etched in Richard's mind. He knew he needed to find out more about that boy. It was a cold and rainy morning when Richard decided to visit the children's shelter again. Since his first encounter with Ethan, the boy had not left his thoughts. He knew he needed to return, to see the boy again and try to understand the connection he had felt so deeply. Dressed in a heavy coat and a hat to protect himself from the rain, Richard arrived at the shelter quietly, hoping to go unnoticed. The shelter was an old building but well cared for, with walls decorated with colorful drawings made by the children. Laughter and children's shouts echoed through the halls, a cacophony of sounds that somehow brought a sense of life and hope to the place. Richard walked slowly, observing the small faces full of curiosity and expectation. When he finally found Ethan, the boy was sitting alone in a corner of the recreation room, absorbed in a storybook. The image was both peaceful and melancholic. Richard approached, trying not to seem threatening. He sat next to Ethan, waiting patiently for the boy to notice him. Ethan lifted his eyes from the book, and his heterochromatic eyes met Richard's once again. There was a moment of mutual recognition, an instant when no words were needed. "You came back," Ethan said simply, as if he had already expected it. "Yes," Richard replied, smiling. "I wanted to know more about you." Ethan hesitated, his expression cautious. He was used to adults coming and going in his life, often promising more than they could deliver. But there was something in Richard's presence that felt different, a sincerity he couldn't ignore. "There's not much to know," Ethan finally said, shrugging. "My mother died, and now I'm here." The simplicity and harshness of Ethan's response hit Richard deeply. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the boy's words. "I'm sorry about your mother," Richard said, his voice full of empathy. "It must be very hard." Ethan nodded but said nothing more. Richard realized that to gain the boy's trust, he would need to be patient. "You know, Ethan," Richard continued. When I was young, I also lost someone very important to me. It's not easy, but it's important to find people you can trust. Ethan looked at him, assessing the sincerity of his words. There was a comfortable silence between them, broken only by the distant sound of other children playing. I like to read, Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. My mother always told me stories. This book was hers. Richard smiled, seeing an opportunity to connect. I love stories too, he said. My mother used to read to me every night before bed. What's your favorite story? Ethan's eyes lit up a bit with the question, and he began to talk about the adventures he read in his mother's book. As the boy opened up, Richard felt the barrier between them diminish. He knew he was taking the first steps to build a bridge, not only to help Ethan but also to face his own ghost from the past. In the days following the shelter visit, Richard couldn't shake thoughts of Ethan. There was something about the boy that left him restless, a sense of déjà vu he couldn't explain. The similarity between Ethan's eyes and his own disturbed him deeply. He knew he needed to understand more about this strange and unsettling connection. One afternoon, after a tiring meeting at the office, Richard took his car and drove to the shelter. He arrived unannounced, anxious to see Ethan again. As soon as he entered, the shelter's director, a kind woman named Mrs. Thompson, greeted him with a warm smile. Good afternoon, Mayor Anderson. It's a pleasure to see you again, she said. Good afternoon, Mrs. Thompson. I'd like to speak with Ethan if he's available, Richard responded, trying to hide the urgency in his voice. Mrs. Thompson nodded and quickly led Richard to the recreation room, where Ethan was once again absorbed in his book. When Richard entered the room, the boy looked up, and a shy smile appeared on his face. Hi, Ethan, said Richard, sitting down next to the boy. How are you today? I'm fine, Ethan replied, carefully closing his book. Richard looked into Ethan's eyes, feeling that inexplicable connection again. You know, Ethan, there's something I need to understand, he began, his voice softer than usual. Your eyes. They remind me of someone. Ethan frowned, curious. My mother always said my eyes were special, he said, his fingers nervously playing with the book's cover. She was right, said Richard with a sad smile. Do you know much about your father, Ethan? Ethan shook his head. My mother didn't talk much about him. She just said he left before I was born. Richard felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew he was about to open a door to the past he had locked away long ago. Ethan, have you ever heard the name Margaret? Ethan's eyes widened. Yes, that was my mother's name. Richard's heart almost stopped. Margaret, a name he had tried to forget but now returned with overwhelming force. He remembered the days when he was involved with her, a forbidden love he tried to bury when he decided to marry another woman. Guilt and regret consumed him at that moment. Ethan, Richard said, his voice trembling slightly, I think I knew your mother many years ago. Ethan looked at him, confused and intrigued. You knew her? Richard nodded slowly, his eyes full of a mix of pain and remorse. Yes, I knew her, and I think we need to talk more about that. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Richard felt the enormity of what he was beginning to unravel. Ethan, with his innocence and resilience, looked at him waiting for answers, not knowing that the truth he was about to discover would change their lives forever. Richard left the shelter with a heavy feeling in his chest. Ethan's words echoed in his mind, and the mention of Margaret brought a flood of long-buried memories. He knew he needed to confirm his suspicions, even if it meant reopening old wounds. Back in his office, Richard closed the door and sat at his desk, feeling the weight of responsibility and guilt. He picked up the phone and called his longtime friend and private detective, Jack Sullivan. Jack was someone Richard trusted implicitly, a man with a special talent for uncovering the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Jack, I need your help, Richard said, his voice grave and serious. Sure, Richard. What's going on? Asked Jack, always straight to the point. I need you to investigate a boy named Ethan. He's about 11 years old and is in a children's shelter in the city. I want to know everything about him and his mother, Margaret. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Margaret?" Jack asked, immediately recognizing the name. "Do you think he could be?" "Yes," Richard answered, cutting him off. "But I need proof. I need to know the truth." Jack agreed and promised to start the investigation immediately. In the days that followed, Richard could barely concentrate on his duties as mayor. His mind was constantly on Ethan and Margaret, and he knew that, one way or another, his life was about to change forever. As Jack worked tirelessly, Richard sank into his own thoughts and memories. He remembered Margaret, how vibrant and full of life she was, and the brief but intense affair they had. At the time, he was young and ambitious, and the idea of a personal scandal could have ruined his political career before it even started. When Margaret discovered she was pregnant, they made the painful decision to part ways to protect their respective lives. Richard's phone rang, pulling him out of his memories. It was Jack. "Richard, we need to talk." "I have news about Ethan and Margaret," said Jack, his voice grave and urgent. They met in a discreet cafe, away from the prying eyes of the city. Jack brought a folder full of documents and photos. Richard looked at Jack, bracing himself for the truth he so feared. "Ethan is, without a doubt, your son," said Jack without preamble. "The medical records confirmed that Margaret gave birth to him about 9 months after you two separated. She never mentioned the father in the documents, but there are several pieces of evidence that corroborate the story." Richard felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief at finally knowing the truth, but dread at what it meant for his current life. He looked at the photos of Margaret and Ethan, feeling a deep sadness for everything he had lost, and for all the wrong decisions he had made. "There's one more thing," Jack continued, hesitating. "Margaret. She died under suspicious circumstances. It wasn't a simple accident. I think someone was after her." The revelation hit like a bomb. Richard knew he couldn't ignore this new information. He needed to protect Ethan, uncover the truth about Margaret's death, and face the consequences of his past actions. The sound of Richard's footsteps echoed through the hallway of his house, each step a prelude to the storm that was about to unfold. With the folder of documents firmly in his hands, he knew he could no longer delay the truth. His heart raced as he thought about how his family would react to the revelations to come. Entering the living room, he was met by the familiar faces of his wife, Claire, and their 2 children, Jessica and Michael. The TV was on, but their curious gazes immediately turned to him. Claire, always perceptive, sensed the tension in the air. "Richard, what's going on?" she asked, standing up and walking toward him. Richard took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "There's something very important I need to tell all of you," he began, feeling the weight of his words. Claire frowned, her concern evident. "What is it?" "You're scaring me." Richard sat on the sofa, gesturing for everyone to do the same. When they were all seated, he opened the folder and placed the documents on the coffee table. 11 years ago, before I married you, Claire, I had a relationship with a woman named Margaret," he began, his voice trembling. "It was a brief affair, but Margaret got pregnant, and I never knew she had the baby." Claire's eyes widened in shock, while Jessica and Michael looked confused. Richard continued, struggling to maintain his composure. "Recently, I discovered that Margaret had a son, a boy named Ethan. He has heterochromia like me," Richard said, pointing to the photo of Ethan in the folder. "Ethan is my son, and he's in a children's shelter, living without knowing who his father is." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Claire turned pale, processing the information. Jessica, the oldest, was the first to speak. "Are you saying we have a half-brother?" she asked, her voice full of disbelief. Richard nodded. "Yes, exactly." Michael, younger and still trying to understand the situation, asked, "Why is he in a shelter? What happened to his mother?" Richard closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the pain of the truth. "Margaret died in an accident, but there's evidence that it might not have been an accident. We're still investigating, but my focus now is to get Ethan out of the shelter and bring him home." Claire stood up, tears in her eyes. "How could you hide something like this, Richard? How could you not know?" Richard stood up as well, holding Claire's hands. I made mistakes, Claire. I made bad choices and now I'm trying to fix them. Ethan needs us. He needs me. And I need your help to bring him home. Claire looked at Richard, her gaze a mix of anger, pain, and perhaps understanding. She knew this truth would change their lives forever. But she also knew they couldn't leave Ethan alone. With a deep sigh, she finally nodded. Let's bring him home, she said, her voice firm. But you have a lot to explain and a lot to prove, Richard. Richard hugged Claire, feeling the wave of relief and responsibility wash over him. He looked at his children, who were still processing the new reality, and knew that the journey ahead would be difficult. But he was determined to make amends with his past and build a future where Ethan could finally find the love and family he always deserved. The news of Ethan's existence spread quickly, like wildfire in a dry forest. The media had a field day with speculations, sensationalist headlines, and heated debates. Richard knew that the next step was crucial. He needed to confront his past and protect his son from a storm he had provoked himself. On a cloudy morning, Richard drove to the cemetery where Margaret was buried. It was a serene place with tall trees and wildflowers growing among the tombstones. He stopped in front of her grave, her name etched into the cold stone, a painful reminder of his loss. He knelt, touching the tombstone gently. "Margaret," he began, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for not being there for you and Ethan. I made selfish choices and now I'm paying the price. But I promise you I will take care of him. I will make sure he has the life you always wanted for him." Tears streamed down Richard's face as he spoke, each word a step toward redemption. He stayed there for a long time, letting the rain wash away his guilt and pain. Finally, he stood up with a new determination. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. When he returned home, he found Claire and their children waiting for him. The house was strangely silent, the tension palpable. Claire hugged him briefly without saying a word, a simple gesture full of meaning. Jessica and Michael, still trying to understand the complexity of the situation, gave him looks of support and uncertainty. "Let's get Ethan," Richard said, his voice firm. "He needs to know he's not alone." They arrived at the shelter and were greeted by Mrs. Thompson, who led them to a small living room where Ethan was waiting. The boy looked up as the family entered, his different colored eyes shining with curiosity and fear. Richard knelt in front of him, extending a hand. "Ethan, this is my family," he said softly. "They want to meet you and give you a home." Ethan looked at Richard, then at Claire, Jessica, and Michael. The hesitation in his eyes was clear, but there was also a spark of hope. Claire approached, kneeling next to Richard. "Hello, Ethan," she said with a warm smile. "We are your family. We are here for you if you allow us." Jessica and Michael took hesitant steps forward, offering smiles and welcoming words. Ethan, still cautious, finally took Richard's hand, feeling the strength and sincerity in that gesture. "I want to go home," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. The Anderson family took Ethan home, a silent but meaningful journey. When they arrived, Richard showed Ethan his new room, carefully and lovingly decorated. There were books on the shelves, toys scattered around, and a comfortable bed, very different from the cold alleys where he used to sleep. That night, while Ethan explored his new home, Richard and Claire sat in the living room, exhausted but relieved. Richard knew the real challenge was yet to come, dealing with public reaction, scandals, and family conflicts. But for now, he was focused on Ethan, on building a relationship of trust and love with his son. Ethan went to bed early but couldn't sleep. The emotions of the day were overwhelming. He got up and went to the living room, where he found Richard looking pensively out the window. "Dad," Ethan said, the words still strange on his lips. Richard turned, surprised but happy. "Yes, Ethan. Will you leave me?" Ethan asked, the vulnerability in his voice cutting Richard's heart. Richard knelt and hugged Ethan tightly. "Never again, son. Never again." The day dawned with palpable tension in the Anderson household. The news of Ethan's arrival had spread through the city, and reactions were mixed. Some supported Richard's decision, admiring his courage to take responsibility for his past and care for his lost son. Others, however, saw the situation as a scandal, a stain on the mayor's reputation, and a betrayal to his family. In the living room, Claire sat on the sofa, her eyes fixed on a distant point. Richard was next to her, holding her hands. The morning had been full of phone calls from reporters and advisors, all wanting a statement, an explanation. The pressure was mounting, and Richard knew he needed to make a difficult decision, one that could change their lives forever. "Claire, I can't keep hiding the truth," Richard finally said, his voice filled with determination. "I need to make a public statement. People have the right to know what's happening, and Ethan deserves to be recognized." Claire looked at him, her eyes full of worry and fear. "Richard, this will expose us even more. The children are family. How will we handle this?" Richard squeezed her hands, feeling the strength and fragility in that touch. "I know it will be hard, but we are in this together. Ethan is part of our family now, and we need to protect him. The only way to do that is by being honest." Jessica and Michael, who had been listening to the conversation from the door, entered the room. Jessica, the eldest and always the most practical, spoke first. "Dad, we will be okay. We can handle this," she said, trying to hide her own insecurity. "Ethan needs to know we are by his side." Michael, still processing everything, just nodded, his big eyes serious. "We are a family," he said simply. Richard felt a wave of pride and love for his children. He knew he was asking a lot from them, but he also knew that together they could overcome anything. He stood up, determined. "I'll call a press conference this afternoon," he said, looking at Claire. "I'll tell the truth, the whole truth, and after that we'll move forward together." Claire slowly nodded, resigned but also hopeful. "We are with you, Richard." That afternoon, Richard prepared for the press conference. Dressed in his most sober suit, he looked at himself in the mirror, feeling the weight of his responsibilities. He knew his words that day would not only shape public opinion but also define the future of his family. When he arrived at the press conference venue, he was greeted by a flurry of camera flashes and the buzz of anxious voices. He stepped onto the makeshift stage, feeling all eyes on him. Claire, Jessica, Michael, and Ethan were in the front row, with Ethan looking nervous but trying to appear brave. Richard took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice clear and firm. "Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Today, I want to talk about something very personal and important. In the last few days, my family and I have gone through a significant change. I discovered that I have a son from a past relationship, a boy named Ethan." There was a murmur of surprise and excitement among the reporters. Richard continued, holding the gaze firmly. "I made mistakes in the past, mistakes that have consequences. But I am here to take responsibility and to fight for my son's future. Ethan." Richard told Ethan's story of his life on the streets, of the boy's courage and resilience. He spoke about the promise he made to Margaret and his determination to correct the mistakes of the past. "We all deserve a second chance," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And Ethan deserves a chance to be loved and to grow up in a supportive family. And I am here to ensure he has that." The crowd fell silent, followed by a murmur of approval. Claire approached Richard, holding his hand, and Ethan stepped forward, looking at the crowd with newfound courage. "I know some of you are disappointed in me," Richard continued, "and I accept that criticism. But I ask you to please look at Ethan and see in him the hope and opportunity for redemption. Let's give him the love and support he deserves." The crowd began to applaud slowly, the sound growing as more people joined in. Richard felt a wave of relief and hope. There was still much to be done, but that moment was a crucial step in the right direction. As the family descended from the stage, they were surrounded by supporters, people who wanted to offer words of encouragement and solidarity. Richard knew they would still face challenges, but with the community's support and the strength of his family, they could overcome anything. The morning after the press conference brought a new beginning for the Anderson family. The house was filled with a tense energy, but there was also a palpable sense of relief. The truth was finally out, and now it was time to start building a life together. Ethan, still adjusting to the new environment, was about to take his first steps into a life he could hardly imagine. Richard woke up earlier than usual. He went downstairs and found Claire in the kitchen making breakfast. She smiled at him and he smiled back, feeling a renewed connection between them. "Good morning," Richard said, approaching and kissing her on the cheek. "How are you feeling?" "Anxious but optimistic," Claire replied. "We have a lot of work ahead, but we're in this together." Richard nodded, knowing that each day would bring new challenges and new opportunities to connect with Ethan. They needed to give him a sense of normalcy and security, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Soon after, Ethan came down the stairs, still half asleep. His differently colored eyes shone in the morning light, reflecting his curiosity and apprehension. Richard approached him with a welcoming smile. "Good morning, Ethan. Did you sleep well?" he asked. Ethan shrugged. "It was strange, but it was good," he said, looking around the spacious kitchen, still adjusting to the new environment. Claire placed a plate of pancakes on the table, and Jessica and Michael entered the kitchen soon after, bringing an air of normalcy to the house. They sat at the table, chatting animatedly about the day ahead. Ethan watched, trying to integrate into this unfamiliar family dynamic. "Today is a big day," Richard said, taking a cup of coffee. "We're going to show Ethan the city, and then stop by the school to start the enrollment process." Ethan looked at him surprised. "School? Already?" Richard smiled. "Yes, already. We want you to feel part of everything we do, and school is a big step towards that. What do you think?" Ethan thought for a moment, then slowly nodded. "I think it would be good," he replied, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. After breakfast, the Anderson family went out to explore the city. Richard and Claire showed Ethan the main points: the park where children played soccer, the local library, and the bakery that made the best donuts in town. They walked together, sharing stories and laughter, trying to create new memories to replace the old and painful ones for Ethan. When they arrived at the school, Richard introduced Ethan to the principal, Mrs. Roberts, a kind woman with a warm smile. She gave Ethan a tour of the school, showing him the classrooms, the library, and the playground where children played during recess. "Ethan, we're very happy to have you with us," said Mrs. Roberts. "I know starting at a new school can be scary, but we're here to help you with everything you need." Ethan smiled shyly. "Thank you," he said, feeling a bit more at ease. The following days were filled with small but important steps. Ethan started attending school, making new friends, and adjusting to the daily routine. Richard and Claire were always by his side, helping him with homework, listening to his stories, and offering him a home filled with love and support. One night, as Richard and Ethan sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Ethan looked at his father with a serious expression. "Dad," he began, the word now coming more easily, "do you think everything will ever be normal?" Richard looked at his son, feeling a wave of emotion. "I think normalcy is different for each person, Ethan. But what matters is that we're together. And together we can create our own normalcy." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth in his heart that he hadn't felt in a long time. "I like that," he said softly. "Our own normalcy." The days following the public announcement were tumultuous. The Anderson family was under the spotlight, and every move they made was scrutinized and criticized. The press was in a frenzy, with sensationalist headlines and television programs endlessly discussing Richard's morality and character. The support he had initially felt began to wane under the weight of public rejection. One morning, while having breakfast, Richard received an urgent call from his press secretary, Mark. "Richard, we need to talk." "Things are getting out of control," said Mark, his voice tense. Richard nodded, hanging up the phone and looking at Claire. Mark said, "We need to meet with the communication team immediately." Claire, always the voice of reason, sighed. "We knew it wouldn't be easy. We'll face it together." At the mayor's office, the atmosphere was tense. Mark and the communication team were agitated, spreading papers and discussing strategies. When Richard entered, everyone fell silent, waiting for his leadership. "Okay, folks, what do we have?" asked Richard, trying to stay calm. The poll numbers are plummeting, said Mark, handing him a report. People are divided. Some think you're brave for taking responsibility for your son, but many are criticizing your infidelity and questioning your integrity. Richard read the report, feeling the gravity of the situation. We need to change this narrative. We need to show people that we're doing this for Ethan's sake, that he deserves a chance to have a normal and happy life. The team discussed various ideas, from exclusive interviews to community events. They decided that the best approach would be a public speech, something Richard always did well, where he could speak directly to the hearts of the people. That night, Richard prepared to face the crowd. The event was held in a central square, and dozens of reporters were present, ready to record every word and expression. Claire, Jessica, Michael, and Ethan stood by his side, offering him the strength he needed. Richard stepped onto the stage, the spotlights momentarily blinding him. He took a deep breath and began to speak. Good evening, everyone. In the past few days, my family and I have gone through a storm of criticism and support. I am here today to speak with honesty and an open heart. He looked at the audience, seeing familiar and unfamiliar faces, all waiting for his words. I made mistakes in the past, and those mistakes have consequences. But I am here to take responsibility and to fight for my son's future. Ethan. Richard shared Ethan's story, his life on the streets, the boy's courage and resilience. He spoke about the promise he made to Margaret and his determination to correct the mistakes of the past. We all deserve a second chance, he said, his voice filled with emotion. And Ethan deserves a chance to be loved and to grow up in a supportive family. And I am here to ensure he has that. The crowd fell silent, followed by a murmur of approval. Claire approached Richard, holding his hand, and Ethan stepped forward, looking at the crowd with newfound courage. I know some of you are disappointed in me, Richard continued, and I accept that criticism, but I ask you to please look at Ethan and see in him the hope and opportunity for redemption. Let's give him the love and support he deserves. The crowd began to applaud slowly, the sound growing as more people joined in. Richard felt a wave of relief and hope. There was still much to be done, but that moment was a crucial step in the right direction. As the family descended from the stage, they were surrounded by supporters, people who wanted to offer words of encouragement and solidarity. Richard knew they would still face challenges, but with the community's support and the strength of his family, they could overcome anything. Despite the growing public acceptance, the conflicts within the Anderson household were far from resolved. The family dynamic was changing rapidly, and each member had their own struggles and emotions to deal with. One night, after a long day, the tension finally reached a breaking point. Richard was in the living room, reviewing some documents, while Claire prepared dinner in the kitchen. Jessica and Michael were in their room trying to do their homework, but the atmosphere in the house was heavy. Ethan, still adjusting to his new life, came down the stairs slowly, hesitant. He felt like he was a burden to the family, despite Richard and Claire's efforts to include him in everything. He entered the living room and looked at Richard, who lifted his eyes from the documents and smiled. Hi, Ethan. Everything okay? Asked Richard, trying to sound casual. Ethan shrugged. Just trying to get used to everything, he said, his voice low. Before Richard could respond, Jessica entered the room, visibly upset. This isn't working, she declared, her hands on her hips. You expect everything to go back to normal, but nothing is normal. Everything has changed. Richard sighed, feeling the weight of his daughter's words. Jessica, we're all trying to adjust. I know it's not easy, but we're doing our best. Jessica shook her head, tears of frustration filling her eyes. No, Dad, you don't understand. It's not just about Ethan. It's about all of us. Nobody asked if we were ready for this. You just decided, and now we have to accept it. Claire, hearing the argument, came out of the kitchen and joined them. Jessica, honey, please try to understand. Ethan needs us. He's part of our family now. Michael, who had followed Jessica into the room, finally spoke up. I don't know how to act around him, he admitted, his voice trembling. It's weird. and I feel guilty for thinking that." Ethan, who had been listening in silence, finally burst out. "I know I'm a problem. I know you didn't want this. If I could, I would go back to where I came from and leave you all alone." Ethan's outburst shocked everyone. Richard stood up and approached his son, kneeling to be at his level. "Ethan, you are not a problem. You are our son, and we will get through this together. I know it's hard, but I promise we will find a way to make this work." Claire approached too, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We love you, Ethan. And yes, we are all adjusting, but we are in this together. We won't give up on you." Jessica, still with tears in her eyes, took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I'm just trying to understand all this. Let's find a way to make this work." Michael nodded, moving closer to Ethan. "Yeah, sorry. Let's try again, okay?" Ethan looked at his new family, feeling a mix of relief and hope. "Okay," he said softly. "Let's try again." That night marked a turning point. The Anderson family realized they needed to be more open and honest with each other, acknowledging their struggles and working together to overcome them. They weren't perfect, but they were willing to fight for love and unity. As dinner was served, the conversations were gentler, filled with promises of mutual support and understanding. Richard knew there would still be challenges, but he felt they were on the right path. They were learning to be a family again, with all their imperfections and struggles, but also with a love that continued to grow and strengthen each day. Days passed, and despite the challenges, the Anderson family began to find a new balance. But full reconciliation was still distant. Richard knew he needed to do more to repair the damage caused, especially with Claire and their children, Jessica and Michael. He decided it was time for an honest and deep conversation, one that could help heal the still open wounds. On a quiet afternoon, Richard invited Claire for a walk in the park. He knew that, away from the pressures and distractions of home, they could talk more freely. They walked side by side, the soft sound of leaves under their feet, until they found an isolated bench where they sat down. "Claire, I know we are still adjusting to all this," Richard began, holding her hand, "but I feel I need to say how sorry I am for everything that happened." Claire looked at him, her eyes reflecting pain and fatigue. "Richard, I understand that you wanted to do the right thing by bringing Ethan into our home, but all this was so sudden. I feel betrayed in a way, as if I didn't have a choice." Richard sighed, feeling the truth of her words. "I know, Claire, and you have every right to feel that way. I made choices in the past that brought us to this point, and now I'm trying to fix things. I want you to know that I'm here, willing to do whatever it takes to regain your trust." Claire squeezed his hand gently. "I want to believe you, Richard, but we need to work on this together. Not just you trying to fix everything alone. We are a team, remember?" Richard smiled, feeling a small relief. "I remember, and I promise I will be a better partner from now on." They continued talking, their voices low and sincere, slowly rebuilding the bridge that had been shaken. Each word, each gesture of affection, was a step toward the reconciliation they both desired. Meanwhile, at home, Jessica and Michael were trying to find ways to connect better with Ethan. Jessica, being the eldest, decided she could help Ethan with his homework, using that as an opportunity to get to know him better. "Ethan, do you need help with your homework?" asked Jessica, entering his room. Ethan looked at her, a bit surprised, but nodded. "Yes, I'm having trouble with math." Jessica smiled and sat next to him. "I'm great at math. Let's solve this together." As they worked, Jessica realized that Ethan was very intelligent and curious, but life on the streets had hindered his education. She was patient, explaining each problem carefully, and gradually, she saw Ethan's confidence grow. Michael, in turn, decided that the best way to connect with Ethan was through soccer. He knew Ethan liked sports, so he invited him for a game in the backyard. "Ethan, do you want to play soccer with me? It can be fun," suggested Michael, holding a soccer ball. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but then accepted the invitation. They spent the afternoon playing, laughing, and competing amicably. It was a moment of pure fun, which helped break down some barriers between them. At night, the family gathered for dinner. There was a lighter and more relaxed atmosphere, a result of the small steps of reconciliation that everyone was taking. Richard and Claire returned from the park, feeling more connected than they had in a long time. "Today was a good day," said Claire, smiling at everyone at the table. "We are making progress one step at a time." Richard looked at his family, feeling grateful for each of them. "And that's all we can ask for. Let's keep going like this together." Ethan smiled, feeling truly part of the family for the first time. He knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but now he had a home and a family that supported him. And that made all the difference. Days turned into weeks, and Richard discovered that fatherhood was a journey full of ups and downs. Raising Ethan, a boy who had gone through so much trauma, brought challenges he had never imagined. However, Richard was determined to be the father Ethan needed, facing each obstacle with patience and love. One morning, Richard found Ethan sitting on the porch, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew something was bothering his son, so he approached and sat next to him. "Good morning, Ethan. Is something wrong?" asked Richard gently. Ethan shrugged, hesitating before responding. "I was just thinking about my mom. I miss her." Richard felt a pang in his heart. He missed Margaret too and knew Ethan's pain was deep. "I understand, Ethan. I miss her too, and it's perfectly normal to feel that way. Do you want to talk about her?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "She was amazing. She always told me to be strong, to never give up. I just wish she were here." Richard put an arm around Ethan's shoulders, offering comfort. "She would be very proud of you, and we are all here for you, to help keep her memory alive and to create new memories together." Ethan nodded, feeling a bit more at ease. "Thank you, Dad." That conversation reminded Richard that being a father was not just about providing physically, but also emotionally and mentally. He needed to be present, listen, and support Ethan in his internal struggles. At school, Ethan faced his own battles. Although he had begun to adapt, he still felt like an outsider in many ways. Some classmates avoided him, curious about his story but unsure how to approach him. Richard noticed this and decided he needed to do more to help Ethan integrate. One afternoon, he met with Ethan's teacher, Mrs. Carter, to discuss how they could better support his son. "I want Ethan to feel part of the class, to make friends and feel safe here," said Richard, his concern evident in his voice. Mrs. Carter smiled understandingly. "I completely understand, Mr. Anderson. Ethan is a bright and resilient boy. Perhaps we can organize group activities that encourage interaction and friendship. I'm sure he would benefit greatly from that." Richard agreed, feeling relieved. "That would be great. I want to do everything possible to make him feel welcome." Meanwhile, at home, Richard also faced the typical challenges of raising a family. Jessica and Michael had their own needs and demands, and balancing everything was a delicate act. He and Claire spent nights discussing strategies, trying to find the perfect balance between giving attention to Ethan and not neglecting their other children. One night, after putting Ethan to bed, Richard found Claire in the kitchen, visibly tired. He hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "We are doing the best we can," he said softly, "and I know we will succeed." Claire turned to look at him, a tired but genuine smile on her face. "I know, Richard. We just need to remember that we are in this together, and that every little progress is a victory." Richard kissed her forehead, feeling grateful to have such a strong and understanding partner. "And we are making progress. Ethan is adapting, the children are adjusting. We are moving in the right direction." That night, Richard felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. He knew that fatherhood was an endless journey, full of unexpected challenges, but also of moments of pure joy and connection. And as he faced these challenges, he knew he was becoming not just a better father to Ethan, but also a better husband and father to his entire family. As months passed, Richard couldn't avoid reflecting on his own journey of redemption. Taking on fatherhood for Ethan had been the first step, but he knew there was much more to be done to repair the mistakes of the past. Margaret's story still hung over him, like a shadow that couldn't be dispelled until the full truth was revealed and faced. One afternoon, Richard decided it was time to visit the place where Margaret worked before her tragic death. He knew that to find peace and move forward, he needed to understand better what had happened. With Claire by his side, he drove to the small cafe where Margaret used to work. Entering, they were greeted by the familiar sound of coffee cups clinking and low conversations. He approached the counter and asked for someone who might have known her well. The manager, a kind woman named Linda, came to meet them. "I remember Margaret very well," said Linda, her eyes full of memories. "She was a wonderful person, always bringing joy to those around her." The news of her death was a shock to all of us. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the sharp pain of loss. "I need to know more about her, about what happened. I feel like there's something I still don't understand completely." Linda nodded, understanding the gravity of the request. "Of course, Mr. Anderson. Margaret was very private about her personal life, but we knew she was going through difficulties. She mentioned feeling followed, that something was wrong." Claire squeezed Richard's hand, offering silent support. "Do you know anyone who could have caused this to her?" asked Richard, trying to stay calm. Linda hesitated before responding. She never mentioned names, but she seemed very worried in the weeks before her death. Maybe there was something more going on, something she couldn't share with us. Richard thanked Linda for her help and left the cafe with Claire, his mind buzzing with thoughts. He knew he needed to dig deeper, to investigate the circumstances surrounding Margaret's death more thoroughly. Back home, he called Jack Sullivan, his private detective friend, and asked to reopen the case. As Jack began the investigation, Richard focused on his family. He wanted to be an example for Ethan, to show that despite mistakes, it was possible to seek redemption and do good. He spent more time with his children, listening to them, supporting them in their school and sports activities. Every moment together was an opportunity to reconnect and strengthen family ties. One night, while helping Ethan with his homework, Richard looked at his son and felt a wave of gratitude. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "You are doing very well in school, and I know your mother would be very proud of you too." Ethan smiled shyly. "Thank you, Dad. I'm trying. And you? You're doing well too." Ethan's words touched Richard deeply. He knew he still had a long way to go, but those words were a reminder that he was on the right path. He felt more determined than ever to continue his journey of redemption, not just for himself, but for his entire family. Shortly after, Jack called with important news. "Richard, I found some new clues. It seems Margaret was involved in something bigger than we thought. She was trying to expose a corruption network involving influential people." The news hit like a bomb. Richard realized that Margaret's death might not have been a simple accident, but a deliberate act to silence her. He knew that to find peace and honor Margaret's memory, he needed to bring the truth to light, regardless of the consequences. As Richard prepared to face this new battle, he felt the strength of his family by his side. They were more united than ever, ready to face the challenges together. Richard's personal redemption journey was far from over, but with each step, he felt closer to correcting the mistakes of the past and building a better future for all of them. In the midst of investigations into Margaret's death, Richard found support from unexpected places. As he tried to untangle the web of corruption that seemed to be behind the tragic accident, he realized he was not alone in this fight. One morning, while having coffee in his office, he received a surprising visit. It was Emily Thompson, an investigative journalist known for her brave and incisive work. Richard knew her only from a distance, but he knew she was one of the best in her field. "Mr. Anderson, may I speak with you for a moment?" asked Emily, her voice firm but friendly. "Of course, Emily. Please come in," Richard replied, curious about the reason for her visit. Emily sat across from Richard, placing a stack of documents on the table. "I have been following your situation and the investigations into Margaret's death. I discovered some information that I think you should see." Richard looked at the documents, feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. "What did you find?" Emily began to explain her findings. Margaret was indeed involved in something very dangerous. She was investigating a network of corruption involving important figures in the city, including politicians and businessmen. She tried to report it, but was silenced before she could reveal everything. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. The suspicions were confirmed, but the truth was even darker than he had imagined. "And you have proof of this?" Emily nodded, pushing the documents closer to Richard. "Here are copies of emails, financial documents, and other evidence Margaret managed to gather." She was getting close to something big, and that put her in danger. As Richard analyzed the documents, Emily continued, "I want to help you bring this to light. I know it's risky, but Margaret deserves justice, and these people need to be held accountable." Richard looked at Emily, feeling deep gratitude. "Thank you, Emily. Your help is invaluable, but we need to be careful. These people will stop at nothing to protect their secrets." Emily smiled, determined. "I know the risks, but I'm willing to take them. Let's expose the truth together." With Emily by his side, Richard felt he finally had a real chance at justice. They began working together, gathering more evidence and preparing a strategy to expose the corruption network. Emily's presence brought new energy and determination to the investigation. Meanwhile, life at home continued to stabilize. Ethan was adjusting well to school and making friends. Jessica and Michael were getting closer to their half-brother, and Claire was becoming a pillar of strength and support for the entire family. One night, while the family was having dinner, Richard shared the news about the investigation. "We are making progress," he said, looking at each of his children and at Claire. "Emily Thompson is helping us, and we are gathering solid evidence. We will get justice for Margaret." Ethan looked at Richard, his eyes full of determination. "I want to help, Dad. I want to be part of this." Richard smiled, feeling immense pride. "And you will, Ethan. We are in this together." With Emily's support and the renewed determination of his family, Richard felt stronger than ever. He knew the fight would be tough and dangerous, but he was willing to do whatever it took to expose the truth and honor Margaret's memory. As the weeks passed, Richard and Emily worked tirelessly, their findings bringing more and more clarity to the corruption network. They knew that soon they would be ready to reveal everything to the public. And when that moment came, Richard would be prepared, with his family by his side, to face the consequences and continue fighting for justice and redemption. The investigation advanced, and Richard, along with Emily, was about to expose the corruption network. However, the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. The pressure was mounting, and Richard knew that the responsible parties would do anything to protect their secrets. It was a cold night when the first real sign of danger appeared. Richard was at home with his family, enjoying a rare quiet evening. Ethan and Michael were playing video games, while Claire and Jessica were making popcorn in the kitchen. Richard's phone rang, and upon answering, he recognized the urgent voice of Jack Sullivan, his detective friend. "Richard, you need to get out of there now," said Jack without preamble. "I received reliable information that someone is going to try to stop you from continuing with the investigation. You and your family are in danger." Richard's heart raced. "What do you mean, Jack? How serious is the threat?" "Serious enough that you need to leave the city for a while. Take your family to a safe place." "Now," insisted Jack. Richard hung up the phone, his face pale. "Claire, we need to leave. Now." Claire saw the panic in Richard's eyes and didn't ask questions. She called the children, and everyone quickly started gathering the essentials. Within minutes, they were in the car, driving out of the city without a specific destination in mind, just the urgent need to escape. As they drove through the dark road, Richard felt the pressure of the moment. He was putting his family in danger by pursuing the truth, but he knew he couldn't give up. Looking at Claire and his children, he felt a tightness in his chest. He needed to protect them at all costs. They stopped at an isolated motel, far from the city. Richard and Claire made sure the children were safe in the rooms before they gathered to discuss the next steps. Emily, who was aware of the situation, called Richard, offering help. "I have a safe place where you can stay," she said. "It's a house outside the city, where you can hide while we continue with the investigation." Richard thanked Emily and accepted the offer. The next day they drove to the safe place, a small but comfortable house, surrounded by trees and far from any civilization. There they finally breathed a little easier. However, the tension was palpable. The children felt the gravity of the situation, and Ethan in particular was worried. "Dad, will they find us here?" he asked, his voice full of fear. Richard knelt before his son, holding his hands firmly. "I promise I will protect all of you. We are here temporarily. We will solve this and then return home." While they were hiding, Emily and Jack continued working on the investigation, gathering more evidence and preparing everything for the public reveal. They knew the moment of crisis was also a golden opportunity. They needed to act quickly and precisely. One night, as the family settled into the safe house, Richard received a call from Emily. "Richard, we are ready. We have all the evidence we need. We will hold a press conference tomorrow morning. You need to be there." Richard knew this was the decisive moment. He looked at Claire, who nodded silently, showing her unwavering support. "I'll be there, Emily," replied Richard, determination in his voice. The next morning, Richard left the safe house under Jack's protection, heading to the press conference venue. When he arrived, he saw a large crowd of journalists waiting. Emily was by his side, ready to reveal everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," began Richard, taking a deep breath, "today we are here to expose a truth that has been hidden for too long. Margaret, a brave woman who tried to bring justice, was silenced by a corruption network. But we will not allow her death to be in vain." Emily presented the evidence, documents, and testimonies, exposing the names involved and the extent of the corruption. The room was filled with gasps and whispers as the truth came to light. Richard felt a mixture of relief and anxiety, knowing the consequences would be severe, but also that justice was being served. As the press conference ended, Richard knew the hardest part was still to come, but he also knew he was not alone. With his family and allies by his side, he was ready to face any challenge to honor Margaret's memory and protect his son. With the truth finally exposed, the city was in an uproar. Richard and Emily's revelation shook the foundations of the corrupt elite, and authorities began to act quickly. Arrests were made, investigations were opened, and justice, which once seemed distant, was now beginning to materialize. Richard, alongside his family, felt that a new chapter was beginning, one where the power of love and truth would prevail. Back at their home, the Anderson family began to rebuild their lives. The tension that had permeated their home was dissipating, replaced by a sense of peace and renewal. Each family member was adapting to the new normal, where love and truth were the foundations of their existence. One afternoon, while everyone was gathered in the living room, Ethan looked at Richard with a shy smile on his face. "Dad, I wanted to thank you for everything. For bringing me here, for protecting me, for loving me. I never thought I could have a family like this." Richard felt his eyes fill with tears. "Ethan, you have brought so much joy to our lives. We are grateful to have you with us. You have taught us the importance of fighting for the truth and never giving up." Claire, sitting next to Richard, took his hand in Ethan's, joining them together. "We are all in this together, and we will continue to fight for what is right, supporting each other." Jessica and Michael joined, forming a circle of joined hands. "We are a family," said Jessica, smiling, "and nothing can separate us." As the family shared that moment of unity, Richard knew that the love that kept them together was stronger than any challenge they might face. The journey they had begun had been full of difficulties and uncertainties, but it was also filled with moments of incredible courage and redemption. In the days that followed, Richard continued his work as mayor with renewed determination. He dedicated himself to cleaning up the city's corruption and implementing policies that would benefit all citizens, especially the most vulnerable. The support from the community, which had once been divided, was now firmly on his side, recognizing his commitment to truth and justice. Ethan, in turn, flourished at school. He made friends, excelled in his classes, and began participating in extracurricular activities, feeling more confident and secure each day. The pain of the past was still present, but with the love and support of his family, he was learning to cope with it and move forward. One night, as the Anderson family gathered for dinner, Richard raised his glass to propose a toast. To this family, which has faced so many storms but has come out stronger than ever. To the love that binds us and the truth that guides us. Everyone raised their glasses, smiling. To family, they said in unison, toasting to the future. After dinner, Ethan and Richard went out to the porch, looking up at the starry sky. "You know, Ethan," said Richard, putting an arm around his son's shoulders, "life is full of ups and downs, but what really matters is how we face those challenges. With love, truth, and courage, we can overcome anything." Ethan looked at his father, his different colored eyes shining with wisdom and hope. "I believe that, Dad. And I know that together we can do anything." As they gazed at the stars, Richard felt a deep gratitude for everything they had achieved. The journey had not been easy, but it had been incredibly rewarding. And with his family by his side, he knew they were ready for whatever the future held.